Morning. I seem to be back on my computer again, so that's a good sign. Today I'm going to talk about stage 3 of consciousness, as discussed in Jung's Map of the Soul, an introduction by Murray Stein. And my reason for doing this is because BTS, the Korean popular singing group and dancing group, is now watching for the results of the new album, Map of the Soul Persona by BTS, which last week was #1 in the world. And BTS based their album on this book, on Dr. Stein's book. And so in support of the BTS fan base, I want to make available some of the information that's contained in Dr. Stein's book, since not everyone will have a copy of it available to them, although I do understand that since this news about the BTS album became known, his book, which is 20 years old now, is a very popular bestseller now, so that's a great thing. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read Dr. Stein's discussion of the third stage of consciousness. Now, keeping in mind that we're talking about consciousness, not awareness. Good morning, Gray. I hope to be looking at your paper a little later today. Moving on. So, in Dr. Stein's book, he says, and mind you, yesterday I did stages 1 and 2, so that's in a separate document. And I'm distinguishing between awareness, which all living beings have at some level, and consciousness, which is being able to abstract and know that, #1, that you're alive, #2, that you will inevitably die, and that sort of thing, which only human beings have, so far as we know. So, if conscious development does continue, which can begin when a new phase of cognitive development leads to the ability to reach a level of abstraction that is relatively free of concretism, one becomes aware that specific projection carriers are not identical with the projections they carry. The persons who have carried the projections can step out from behind the projections, and as a result, they often become de-idealized. At this stage, the world loses much of its naive enchantment. The projected psychic contents become abstract, and they now manifest as symbols and ideologies. Omniscience and omnipotence are no longer granted to human beings, but such qualities are projected onto abstract entities such as God, faith, and truth. Philosophy and theology become possible. Supreme values take on the numinous power once attributed to parents and teachers. The law or the revelation or the teachings become invested with archetypal projections, and the concrete everyday world becomes relatively free of projections and can be interacted with as a neutral. To the extent that this stage of consciousness is attained, a person becomes less vulnerable to fears of evil enemies and forces. One need not fear the reprisals of human enemies because God is in control, or it is assumed that one can manipulate and take control of the world rationally because it obeys the laws of nature and is free of spirits and demons who might not like a highway here or a dwelling place there. One does not seem to keep running into oneself, feeling so directly the pain of what one is doing to the object. The spontaneous empathetic response to suffering among creatures in the world and to the destruction of the natural world is decreased to a considerable extent when the self-object dichotomy has reached this point. To many, this does not seem to be an advance, but rather a decline in consciousness. But it must be recognized that the emotional reactions of empathy manifested in the earlier developmental stages are largely based on projection and have little to do with an objective evaluation of what is happening to the object. When the projections are removed from concrete objects in the world, visionary political leaders and charismatic ideologues create abstractions in the form of ideas, values, or ideologies by the projections fed into concepts that state what is of highest value and the greatest good in their perception. On the basis of these values, one can develop a set of imperatives and oughts that stood in the place of the natural, spontaneous emotional relationships that less conscious people enjoy with the world. In place of unconscious empathy based on participation mystique or projection, one has rules that dictate duty. One does the right thing ecologically, for instance, not out of a feeling, but out of duty, not because one gets sick with pain for the destruction of the natural world, but because of a moral imperative to sort the garbage and burn less fuel. In this third stage of consciousness, which is, I believe, what my friend's father reached, for he was a religious man in the traditional sense, there are still projections of unconscious material. But these projections are invested not so much in persons and things, but in principles and symbols and teachings. Of course, these projections are still considered real in an almost concrete sense. God really does exist somewhere. He or she is a distinct personality, and so on. As long as one believes that an actual God will punish or reward one in the afterlife, this indicates a stage 3 level of consciousness. The projection has simply become transferred from the human parent to a more abstract mythological figure. Okay, so I'm going to stop there for today. That's the third stage of consciousness. And believe it or not, there's still 4 more stages that we're going to get to. But we certainly see a lot of people in the world who are at this third stage of consciousness and who are very devout in their religions. And even though in the physical world we can't point to a God or to the devil, and we can't find heaven up there and hell down there, they still believe that there's a God somewhere. And indeed that's true, but that's the 5th stage, and we need to get to that. And so let me just quickly look. So XXTT, welcome. Now, it happened by synchronicity today that I was looking through some of Dr. Jung's other writings, and I'm looking at volume 8 of the collected works of C.G. Jung, The Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche, which includes the topic of synchronicity. But in this, it just happened, and therefore by synchronicity I pay attention to these things because they're meaningful. And we're talking about stages of psychological development and stages of life that we go through. I'm going to read just one page, just a little bit more than one page of this. And this is from an essay by Dr. Jung entitled The Stages of Life. and it begins with paragraph 750 of volume 8 and 751. And so let's understand why problems are important to us in raising consciousness. So this is stages of life. If psychic life consisted only of self-evident matters of fact, which on a primitive level is still the case, we could content ourselves with a study of empiricism. The psychic life of civilized man, however, is full of problems. We cannot even think of it except in terms of problems. Our psychic processes are made up, to a large extent, of reflections, doubts, experiments, all of which are almost completely foreign to the unconscious, instinctive mind of primitive man. It is the growth of consciousness which we must thank for the existence of problems. They are the Danaan gift of civilization. I don't know what Danaan refers to. It's D-A-N-A, a umlaut N. Okay, so anyway, problems are the Danaan gift of civilization. And I'll just put that word in the chat, since okay, so maybe someone can look that one up for us, because he again has stumped the stars, as he often does. Okay, so they are the Danaan gift of civilization. It is just man's turning away from instinct, his opposing himself to instinct, that creates consciousness. Instinct is nature and seeks to perpetuate nature, whereas consciousness can only seek culture or its denial. Even when we turn back to nature, inspired by the Rousseau-esque longing, we cultivate nature. As long as we are still submerged in nature, we are unconscious, and we live in the security of instinct, which knows no problems. Everything in us that still belongs to nature shrinks away from a problem, for its name is doubt, and wherever doubt holds sway, there is uncertainty and the possibility of divergent ways. And where several ways seem possible, there we have turned away from the certain guidance of instinct and are handed over to fear. For consciousness is now called upon to do what nature has always done for her children, namely, to give a certain unquestionable and unequivocal decision. And here we are beset by an all too human fear that consciousness, our Promethean conquest, may in the end not be able to serve us as well as nature. Problems thus draw us into an orphaned and isolated state where we are abandoned by nature and are driven to consciousness. There is no other way open to us. We are forced to resort to conscious decisions and solutions, where formerly we trusted ourselves to natural happenings. Every problem, therefore, brings the possibility of a widening consciousness, but also the necessity of saying goodbye to childlike unconsciousness and trust in nature. This necessity is a psychic fact of such importance that it constitutes one of the most essential symbolic teachings of the Christian religion. It is the sacrifice of the merely natural man, of the unconscious, ingenuous being whose tragic career began with the eating of the apple in paradise. The biblical fall of man presents the dawn of consciousness as a curse. And as a matter of fact, it is in this light that we first look upon every problem that forces us to greater consciousness and separates us even further from the paradise of unconscious childhood. I'll just read that sentence again because I don't think I got the emphasis right. And as a matter of fact, it is in this light that we first look upon every problem that forces us to greater consciousness and separates us even further from paradise of unconscious childhood. Every one of us gladly turns away from his problems, if possible. They must not be mentioned, or better still, their existence is denied. We wish to make our lives simple, certain, and smooth, and for that reason, problems are taboo. We want to have certainties and no doubts, results and no experiments, without even seeing that certainties can arise only through doubt and results only through experiment. The artful denial of a problem will not produce conviction. On the contrary, a wider and higher consciousness is required to give us the certainty and clarity we need. Okay, so I think that that's a very important idea, that we only get certainty by people who have experienced problems in the past and who have learned to come through those problems, and they can give us certainty about the proper steps forward. Now, tomorrow I am unable to do a 10 a.m. Reading because I have a personal commitment, and so I am going to endeavor to do a reading tomorrow. It will probably be around 11:30 or 12 noon instead of in the 10 o'clock time frame, or a little later. So I will do the next stage, which is the stage of consciousness that unfortunately we're in American politics. Thank you for that truck. Okay. The stage that we're in American politics today is stage 4, and I will be addressing that tomorrow. And so let me go back to look at your comments here. Primus Omega says, opportunity for learning advance, sir. Thank you. And Hunger Stormy is here. Welcome. Gray 8 says the Danaan and Danites are a mystery people for many historians, speculated to have been Greek seafarers in the late Bronze Age. Now, that's interesting. Let me go back and look at that again. How did he use this? Okay, and he says they are the Danaan gift of civilization. In other words, the mysterious coming of civilization, I suppose. And Gray says, sons of Dan, Jacob's 5th son. Gray also says, according to the book of Genesis, Dan was the 5th son of Jacob and was mother Bilhah's first son. He was the founder of the Israelite tribe of Dan. Miles says, sorry, late to the party. Could you give a recap in your own words of the first 3 stages? The physical word, mom and dad. Okay, so, well, you've actually done it. So the first stage is where we're living in participation mystique, where we don't see ourselves as separate from the world around us. And that's true of all the lower animals, because all the lower animals are in a herd or whatever, and they're just going through life, and there are no problems because, for the gazelle, even though a lion may come and eat it, it's no problem because the gazelle never thought about it as being a problem. It's just the way of life. And so it happens, and the herd keeps going on, and there are lions and tigers that eat gazelles every so often, but the gazelle doesn't really think about that. It just goes on in its herd, and the weak ones get culled away by the lions, so it's no problem. And so participation mystique is like that, where you're just living on instinct. Then the second phase is when you start to project basically divinity on your parents, and it's living in a new stage of development where you have a few problems, like you have to learn to be toilet trained, and your godlike parents are teaching you to be toilet trained, and you obey because God says so, and so that's the second stage. But in the third stage, we realize that our parents aren't divine, and so in the third stage, our parents are not divine, and we tend to project that divinity onto a church or a God image of some sort, a metaphysical God image. And it doesn't matter what religion we're in, because we all do this. And many people never go beyond the third stage. But our issue is that we've now gone beyond the third stage, and so we have to consider that. And that I'm going to take up in tomorrow's video. Gray says, when the Danites had settled between the tribes of Judah, Benjamin, and Ephraim, a problem arose. Their territory was too small, and they could not expand north, south, or east, for that was their brethren's territory. Okay, and so they took to the sea. Interesting. So the Danites took to the sea, and oh, by the way, they probably ran into other people, and they learned new things, and so they would come back and bring mysterious new information into the civilization, I'll bet. And okay, so actually this has taken less time than I thought it would. And so I think I will go on with stage 4 now. And that will get you into thinking about our current world. And so let me just see where that... Okay, so I'm going to be reading from pages 183 to 185, and this is the 4th stage of consciousness. And so I'll have to change the title of this video, but since you're all here and we're all wide awake this morning, let's face the 4th stage. The 4th stage represents the radical extinction. Can everybody hear all right? Because I have this truck behind me, and I hope that that's not interfering with the sound. If it is, I might still put this off. If someone would comment on the sound on the chat, that would be helpful. What's that? These people are my nemesis. I mean, I love to have people working on my building or on my garden or whatever it is, but they're often very noisy. Okay, so Destiny says it's just fine for me. Now I have a siren. Oh, wonderful. Okay, the 4th stage represents the radical extinction of projections, even in the form of theological and ideological abstractions. This extinction leads to the creation of an empty center, which Jung identifies with modernity. Okay, so Jung is talking about the fact that over the 500-year period after 1500, the scientific method punched holes in many religious myths. And so therefore we ended up with many atheists and agnostics. And so that's modernity, the modern situation. This is the modern man in search of his soul. The sense of soul, of grand meaning and purpose in life, immortality, divine origin, a God within, is replaced by utilitarian and pragmatic values. And by the way, Modern Man in Search of a Soul is the name of a book by C.G. Jung, and I did read it in to the YouTube channel, so you can put a search on the YouTube channel and put in Modern Man in Search of a Soul, and you can find those videos. Okay, the sense of a soul, of grand meaning and purpose in life, immortality, divine origin, a God within, is replaced by utilitarian and pragmatic values. Does it work? Becomes the primary question. Humans come to see themselves as cogs in a huge socio-economic machine, and their expectations for meaning are scaled down to bite-sized chunks. One settles for moments of pleasure and satisfactions of manageable desires, or one becomes depressed. Gods no longer inhabit the heavens, and demons are converted into psychological symptoms and brain chemical imbalances. The world is stripped of projected psychic contents. No more heroes, no more evil villains. Humans become realistic. Principles are only relatively valid, and values are seen as derived from cultural norms and expectations. Everything cultural appears to be manufactured and without inherent meaning. Nature and history are regarded as the product of chance and the random play of impersonal forces. Here we arrive at the attitude and feeling tone of the modern person: secular, atheistic, perhaps slightly humanistic. A modern person's values seem hedged about with reservations, conditions, maybes, not sures. The modern stance is relativistic. In this fourth stage of consciousness, it seems as if psychic projections have disappeared altogether. Jung points out, however, that this is undoubtedly a false assumption. In actuality, the ego itself has become invested with the contents previously projected out onto others and objects and abstractions. Thus, the ego is radically inflated in the modern person and assumes a secret God Almighty position. The ego, rather than laws or teachings, is now the recipient of projections, good and bad. The ego becomes the sole arbiter of right and wrong, true and false, beautiful and ugly. There is no authority outside of the ego that exceeds it. Meaning must be created by the ego. It cannot be discovered elsewhere. God is not out there anymore. It's me. While the modern person appears to be reasonable and grounded, actually he is mad. But this is hidden, a sort of secret kept even from oneself. Jung believed this fourth stage to be extremely dangerous, to be an extremely dangerous state of affairs for the obvious reason that an inflated ego is unable to adapt very well to the environment and so is liable to make catastrophic errors in judgment. While this is an advance of consciousness in a personal and even a cultural sense, it is dangerous because of the potential for megalomania. Anything goes. If I want to do it and I figure I can get away with it, it must be okay. Not at all immune to the seductive persuasions of the shadow, the ego is easily led to indulge in the shadow's lust for power and its wishes to gain total control of the world. This was Nietzsche's Superman, and this hubris is reflected in the various social and political catastrophes of the 20th century, already prefigured in Dostoevsky's protagonist Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. We now witness a human being who will kill an old woman simply to see how it feels. The stage 4 person is no longer controlled by societal conventions relating either to people or values. Consequently, the ego can consider unlimited possibilities of action. This does not mean that all modern people are sociopathic, but the doors for such a development are wide open. And the worst cases might be those that look most reasonable, the best and the brightest who think they can calculate an answer to all questions of policy and morality. Jung said jokingly that on the street one meets all stages of development: Neanderthals, medieval people, moderns, people at all conceivable levels of conscious development. Living in the 20th century does not automatically confer the status of modernity on one's development of consciousness. Not everybody approaches stage 4. In fact, many people cannot bear its demands. Others consider it evil. The fundamentalisms of the world insist on clinging to stages 2 and 3 out of fear of the corrosive effects of stage 4 and of the despair and the emptiness it engenders. But it is a real psychological achievement when projections have been removed to the extent and individuals take personal responsibility for their destinies. The trap is that the psyche becomes hidden in the ego's shadow. These first 4 stages in the development of consciousness have to do with ego development and the first half of life. The person who has achieved the self-critical and reflective ego characteristic of stage 4 without falling into megalomaniac inflation has done extremely well in developing consciousness and is highly evolved in Jung's assessment. But further development in the second half of life is reserved by Jung for a 5th stage, a postmodern stage, which has to do with approaching the reunification of conscious and unconscious. In this stage, there is conscious recognition of ego limitation and awareness of the powers of the unconscious, and a form of union becomes possible between conscious and unconscious through what Jung called the transcendent function and the unifying symbol. The psyche becomes unified, but unlike stage 1, the parts remain differentiated and contained within consciousness. And unlike stage 4, the ego is not identified with the archetypes. The archetypal images remain other. They are not hidden in the ego's shadow. They are now seen as in there, unlike in stage 3, where they are out there in metaphysical space somewhere, concretely, and they are not projected onto anything external. All right. So that is stage 4, and I think that you can probably see some people in our culture, and certainly in the United States, we can see in our culture some people who've become ego-inflated and megalomaniac, and we can see the danger of having those people in charge of our government. And so obviously we need this 5th stage to be able to control that, and we are seeing leaders that have achieved the 5th stage emerge. They're typically, mature human beings that have grown up in a mature manner, and So they have controlled that. And so the important thing to recognize here is that there are stages of development, and just because you meet another adult doesn't mean that they're at your same stage. They might be lower or higher, and that's a matter for reflection, and it's a matter for self-protection, honestly, because if you can be conscious of what people think about the world, then you can understand how to interact with them. And obviously, people in the megalomaniac stage, which is the case of some both Islamic and Christian fundamentalists, use people in the second and third stage who are not conscious yet of these factors. And so they use people in let's say the third stage, where they're projecting out on a religion or an organization, and so they believe completely. I'm sure every male Muslim terrorist who did a suicide bombing thought that he was immediately going to be placed in the presence of 72 virgins. And of course, we haven't been able to register their disappointment when they discovered, well, actually they didn't discover, but we haven't been able to register their disappointment. But I'm sure that there are people in the megalomaniac stage, in stage 4, who have manipulated people in stage 3. And this by no means should suggest to you that I mean that there is no God. That's a different matter entirely. Okay, so going back here. So, all right, so we're going on, and hopefully that comes out on the video all right. Grace's meaning and absurdity. God is found in the relative when they come together within, and movement toward one or the other leads to the inflation or despair. Absolutely. And when Dr. Jung said, I have no need to believe, I know, that was an epiphany for me. And I said, I know. Okay, so what do I know? And I had to spend the next 10 years working it out and trying to understand Dr. Jung's position before I could confirm in my own psyche what I know. And I know what I know. And one of the things that I know is that you cannot know without an experience, without the experience, the religious experience, the experience of the God image, the experience of God as the ancients saw it. And up until then, it's just belief, and someone can take away your belief by saying, no, that's not right. Here's the real world, and everybody wants to put things on the real world when actually the psyche is also the real world. Okay, we have both the physical world and the psyche, and the psychic world. And by psychic, I don't mean woo-woo magical psyche. I mean the psyche that we all live with and come up in our consciousness with. Is it possible that in society all the first stages of consciousness are fused together? Well, they certainly are fused together because they're the stages of growing up. And what we have to understand is that children are born as wild animals, and they have to be taught and shown how to do things throughout their childhood and young adulthood. And so there are many people in all of these stages all of the time. And the idea of raising children is the idea of bringing children through these stages to at least some level. It depends also on the stage of the parent where the child is going to get. And that's not always easy. And so the point that I would make is that we need to understand that we go through stages of life throughout life. I don't by any means think I'm done with going through the stages of life, given that I'm 72 years old. And I know I have some rather unpleasant stages ahead of me, but I'm looking forward to eating a few apples before I get to that. And so they are fused together in society. But, caveat emptor, whenever somebody approaches you, it wouldn't hurt to try to scale where people are. And so XXTT says, does it become one stage? And I would say, no, it doesn't become one stage. I mean, these are levels of consciousness that we raise ourselves up through. And as I said, there's a reference to actually 7 stages in Dr. Stein's book, and here we're only on stage 4. So, but, one of the interesting things about politics is people are always scratching their heads saying, wow, we already went through this 50 years ago. Why are we doing it again? And the answer is that society is always coming up in consciousness. And if we got to a certain point, let's say in the mid-70s, and we all thought that we had achieved a great deal, and then we stopped paying attention to it. And so what happened was that new people came along, and they all had to be brought up in consciousness to the level we already were, and maybe we didn't do that so well. And so, if we take my daughters and the issue of abortion as an example, they didn't live in the bad old days before Roe v. Wade, and so for them, it's an issue of murder of a baby. But there are many other societal issues involved, and those of us who went through those pre-Roe v. Wade days remember how bad it was. I mean, my mother told me 2 things on her deathbed. Okay, 2 things that she wanted to make sure she told me that had been secrets to me. One was that she had voted for John F. Kennedy in 1960 against my father's wishes. And number 2, but more importantly, my 2 grandmothers had had 5 abortions between them in the 1920s, okay? And, that was partially because there was not proper birth control available to them at that time. And so as a result, they ended up with unwanted pregnancies. My 2 grandmothers both raised 3 children, so that's 6 children, but 5 children that they conceived were aborted because they knew that they couldn't handle those extra children. And this is something that I never knew. I thought that my grandmothers had been pure Victorian women. And it never occurred to me that they would do such a thing, but nonetheless they did. And so knowing that, and knowing how my own grandmothers, who were middle-class Victorian ladies, dealt with it and had to deal with it when abortion was illegal, I therefore see that it's better if we do it in a safe environment, because we were killing young women, and that's not good either. So anyway, but the problem is that my daughters didn't know that. They didn't go through the horrors of what was happening before Roe v. Wade. So if abortion is once again forbidden, all we will get is a very large percentage of the medical community that's still committing felonies, as they were during that time. And it just wasn't good. It was not good for a healthy society. So we had 15% of the medical community committing felonies. We had young women who were reduced to home methods that killed many young women, and women who were born, let's say, 10 years before Roe v. Wade until now, were not conscious of those issues. And, we will be conscious of them once again, and it will brutalize our society once again if we forbid abortion. So that's my concern. So let's see. Okay, so I don't know how much all of you have heard about this. I regret, I'm going to put it on chat, that I have lost my connection, it seems. Okay. I am going to look into another broadcast software. Okay, so I'm going to discontinue for today because this doesn't seem to be productive, and I will return tomorrow at such time as I can achieve it. So thank you for joining me today. Talk to you soon.